Okay, so last week we looked at both Chinese folk religion and Confucianism. So this week we're going to move to another ancient tradition that's greatly impacted Chinese civilization and culture, namely Taoism. Now notice I pronounce it like a D, though you'll usually see it spelled with a T. But it's pronounced Tao. Sometimes you'll see it with a D, but most of the times if you're looking on books, it'll be with a T, but it's pronounced Taoism. It's the name associated with the founder of Taoism is Lao Tzu. Sometimes you'll see it TSE. Okay, so it's Lao, but it's Lao Tzu is usually seen to be the founder. Lao Tzu means venerable master. So that's what the term means. He was a philosopher known as the author of a book known as the Tao Te Ching, which I'll get to in a moment. So as a central figure in Chinese culture, both the nobility and the common people claim Lao Tzu in their lineage. He was honored as an ancestor of the Tang imperial family, 7th to 10th century, and was granted the title Supreme, Mysterious, and Primordial Emperor. That's a pretty exalted title. Popular legends, now these are popular legends, say Lao Tzu was conceived when his mother gazed upon a falling star, and that he stayed in the womb for 62 years before being born. So, there's the virgin birth, and then there's, which one is more? Yeah. He's said to have emerged as a grown man with a full gray beard. So he didn't go through. Now, these are common legends, remember. But, the earliest reliable historical reference to Lao Tzu is found in a work called The Records of the Grand Historian by one Sima Qian, 145 to 86 BCE, which combines a number of stories. So there are a lot of stories about him. The first is that he was said to be a contemporary of Confucius, and was an official in the imperial archives, the library of the Zhou dynasty, who wrote a book in 2 parts before suddenly mounting a water buffalo and heading west, which means heading into the countryside. And you'll see why that's important when we start talking about Taoist ideas. So he was getting away from the urban centers. In the second, he's known as the Old Master, also a contemporary of Confucius, who is said to have written this book, the Tao Te Ching, which we'll talk about, in 15 parts. In the third, he was a grand historian and astrologer, known as Old Long Ears, who lived during the 4th century. So a lot of different stories. When that happens, it tends to tell you we really don't know. It's a lot of folklore comes into this, a lot of legend. What we have are the texts. And to some degree, we say, okay, this was written by Lao Tzu, and we have a drawing. What does that really mean to you? It's a name with an image, but it's the text that you will turn to find out what Taoism is about. So even if you think like George Washington, we have this image of him and a name, but who was George Washington? How would we know who George Washington is? The best you can do is what people have written about him or what he wrote about himself. So that's what history is all about. It's about written texts. And that's what we base our knowledge on. And they're often very variable and confusing and contradictory, etc., etc. What's interesting about the long ears, and it's a later story, is that the Buddha also has long ears, which are associated with wisdom on the one hand. When we think of wisdom, we think of talking, speaking. Wisdom comes from listening, big ears, and also the notion, and this came in from Mahayana Buddhism, that the big ears hear the suffering cries of the world. which leads to compassion. In any case, he has that part to his legend. In the mid-20th century, the consensus of most scholars, both the Chinese and the European, is that Lao Tzu was, his historicity is doubtful. Not that there wasn't a Lao Tzu, but that what has been said about him is very questionable. Probably there were a number of different people who composed the text and one name was given. That's usually considered the case about the Iliad and the Odyssey with Homer as well. Probably not one person who wrote it. These were texts that were put together over time, and there may or may not have been a Lao Tzu. Again, what is important if you're studying Chinese culture is people believe there was one. So that's what's significant. Again, so Taoism, a philosophical and religious tradition that emphasizes living in harmony with the Tao. What is the Tao? Which is often translated as the way, the path, or the principle. So the Tao is the way, the Tao is the path, the Tao is the principle. It also denotes something that is both the source and driving force behind everything that exists. It's the source and driving force behind everything that exists. It is ultimately ineffable. Do you know that term? Ineffable means you can't describe it. As expressed as follows in the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. Now, the words cannot encompass it, because words are always cognitive ideas. You can say something, and we will, but that does not encompass the Tao. The Tao is beyond all words. Just as in the Jewish tradition, Yahweh was beyond all words, couldn't even name Yahweh. So you find this notion in nearly every religious tradition. It is what I call the more mystical level. Behind everything is something which cannot be named. Because to name something is to reduce it. When you think, what does a name do? It isolates something, makes it separate, makes it distinct. The ultimate can't be separate and distinct. It can be the source, but it can't be a thing. So this is what we find in the Tao Te Ching. So from the Tao Te Ching, chapter 3, the Tao that can be trodden is not the enduring and unchanging Tao. The name that can be named is not the enduring and unchanging name. Conceived of as having no name, it is the originator of heaven and earth. Conceived of as having a name, it is the mother of all things. Without desire, it must be found. If its deep mystery, we would sound. But if desire always within us be, its outer fringe is all that we shall see. So that's also very similar to certain aspects of Buddhism. Attachment always keeps us in samsara, keeps us in this flux. The Tao is the source of everything, but it's not the flux itself. So the Tao also has connections with two complementary forces known as yin and yang, which many of you have heard about, and whose relative qualities could be used to delineate nearly all phenomena. And I'll have much more to say about yin and yang shortly. So hold on to that. So as I already mentioned, its central text is called the Tao Te Ching, widely regarded to be the author being Lao Tzu. It's a compact and ambiguous little book, if you've ever read in it. It has all these little sayings that sort of, you can take it one way or another. It's not necessarily straightforward. And like I said, it's attributed to Lao Tzu. It's a text of about 5,000 Chinese characters in 81 brief chapters or sections. If you buy it in the bookstores, it's about this thick. It's not thick at all. Some evidence that the chapter divisions were later additions, when it was edited. So we probably don't even have the original text. Just like we don't have the original Iliad, we don't have the original Gospel. We don't have most original texts. We have manuscripts that are from down the line. So it has two parts. The first part is called the Tao Ching, which is chapters 1 through 37, and then the second part is the Te Ching, the Tao Te Ching, chapters 38 through 81. And again, they were edited together in one text. They were probably two separate texts, but they were edited together to be one text. Just as there was no New Testament. That was an edited, brought all the different books together and edited and then called the New Testament. So, yeah. Yeah, it was translated into, it's been translated into English, translated into French, translated into German, translated into Swahili. And yeah, you get all these different translations, and you can see what translations do. In any case, the text has few grammatical particles, and it encourages varied interpretations. That's its ambiguity. It wants you to look at the text and say, what the hell does that mean? Okay? And then try and interpret it as best you can, rather than just saying, this is this, this is this, this is this, this is this. It's not didactic. It's very fluid, and we might call it ambiguous. Some people might take one thing out of the passage, some people might take another, which is important because Taoism puts lots of significance on what is going on inside of you, how you are interpreting the world. Not that the world is just coming at you and you're just a blank slate. Okay, so it combines two major strategies, if you want to call them that. Short statements and intentional contradictions. Intentional contradictions. We'll get to that when we get to the yin and the yang. Intentional contradictions. So the title Tao Te Ching, designating the work static as a classic, was only first applied during 157 BCE. So there were these segments of text, wasn't even called something 100 years or so after the texts were. So that tells you something. These are these fluid texts that later came together, and then what's the term when it becomes official? Canonized. But that happens in every religious tradition that I know of. There are texts, usually start oral. People say, how do you have an oral text? Well, that's because you, being based in written text, think the text only means written. All a text is a group of words. You don't have to have them written down. They can be memorized. And most religious traditions early on, their texts are memorized. At a certain point, they're written down. They're often variations. And someone decides what? We got to put this together somehow and make sense out of it and make it official. That's when you get the canonization of religious literature. Always comes pretty far down the line from the original community. Okay. So in addition to the Tao Te Ching, there's another work by this man, Zhuangzi. He's sort of if Lao Tzu is sort of the Paul of Taoism, this gentleman would be something like St. Augustine. I mean, he's a later philosopher who becomes very significant in the Taoist tradition from the 4th century. So we're talking quite a while later. Known for his skepticism when it came to knowing. How do you know anything? I think his statement was something like, I know nothing, and I don't even know that I know that. Because what does it mean to know something? Think about that. To know. And he was often condemning of people who claim to know. And this is it. in any case, he was considered part of the official canon. He was added in. And his work, known as the Zhuangzi, which I have next to him, so he's the person, the Zhuangzi is the text, consists of stories and maxims that exemplify the nature of the ideal Taoist sage. What did the ideal Taoist sage look like? If you want to know, go get this book from the library or order it on Amazon or go down to a local bookstore and purchase it and read it. The text contains numerous anecdotes, allegories, parables, and fables, often expressed with a type of irreverence or humor. Skeptics are often kind of irreverent. Right? They look at the official position with somewhat of a smile. Recurring themes include embracing spontaneity. What is spontaneity? When you do something spontaneously. You just do, yeah. Let's go to New York. Okay? Well, let's plan this trip out, and we're going to take 3 weeks to plan it out, and we're going to know everywhere we go, everywhere we stay, every place we eat at, everything we see, and if it doesn't go right, we're going to panic. Spontaneity says, go. I noticed that when I was younger, I was much more spontaneous. We went on a trip around the world with our 2 kids when they were 8 and 10, and we just went. When we arrived in Florence, we said, we'll find some place to stay. Today, I'm going to have a place booked. I'm going to make sure that I have transportation. And I look back and I say, gee, I think I had more fun earlier on. So we tend to lose that. So he emphasized spontaneity and the achieving of what he called spiritual freedom. Not being tied down by dogma. Spiritual freedom from the human world and its conventions. Freedom from convention to some extent. Taoism was very popular in the 60s here. And I think you'll see why. Because it has a counterculture flavor to it. It has a counterculture flavor. The work aims to illustrate the arbitrariness and ultimate falsity of dichotomies that human societies create, such as good and bad, large and small, life and death, human and nature. We divide things into dichotomies rather than seeing them as part of one whole. So Taoism is very much opposed to dichotomies. And when we get to the yin and yang, we'll see how that really works. In contrast, the focus was on good morals and personal duty, which most Chinese philosophers proposed. He proposed perspectivism. There's no one right. Everyone's trying to tell you, especially government leaders, philosophical leaders, this is the right way to do things. He said there's more than one perspective on things. And when cultures lose that, then they lose the freedom. Because then they become rigid. They become what we call ideological. The ideology, which becomes the official. And I think I mentioned last time, even Confucianism over time became rigid and became ideological. You have groups of scholars who know the proper ideology and teach it to the next generation, who teach it to the next generation, not allowing for any change or reinterpretation. Because to reinterpret is seen as what? Heresy. It happens in every tradition, by the way. Okay, one of the most famous stories that comes from the second chapter of this book, it's the chapters on the equality of things, consists of a dream that he is briefly recalling. Once Zhang Zhu dreamed he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering about, happy with himself, and doing as he pleased. He didn't know that he was Zhuang Zhu. Suddenly, Zhuangzi woke up, and there he was, solid, unmistakable Zhuangzi. But he didn't know if he was Zhuangzi, who had dreamt he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was Zhuangzi. It's a very famous story. How do we know? When we're dreaming, don't we think we know what we're dreaming is true? You don't have. I don't recall many dreams which I'd call a reflective. You say, am I dreaming? You're dreaming something that seems pretty real. So the question is, how do you know that your dream state isn't you, and this is like the dream, whereas we think of the dream state as not real, and this is what's real? It's an interesting little story that he tells. It's very famous in Taoist tradition. While much Taoist thought was and is considered individualistic, institutions evolved over time, as in any tradition, and a number of schools developed. But they all revered Lao Tzu. They tended to have their different interpretations, but they had the different rituals, different practices of doing things. But it was interesting. One of the basic goals was immortality. One of the basic goals of a lot of Taoist thinking was immortality. How do we obtain immortality? So, well, we're going to get into some metaphysics in a moment. Remember, I said the ultimate reality, the Tao, is formless, okay, beyond name. But tradition does make reference to a pantheon of gods and goddesses who populate various dimensions of reality. This is very similar to Hinduism, where the ultimate ground, Brahman, is beyond all form, all thought, but manifests itself into form. And so Taoism has that as well, and it has these various gods and goddesses who are not the ultimate ground themselves, but are manifestations or emanations of that ground. They were understood as manifestations, not independent metaphysical realities. And this was one of the most popular. Do you recall this fellow from last time? I spoke about the Jade Emperor when I talked about folk religion. And it may well be that folk religion incorporated the Jade Emperor from Taoism, or Taoism incorporated the Jade Emperor from folk religion. No one's quite sure. But this Jade Emperor becomes very important. According to mythology, it was said that the Jade Emperor was originally the crown prince of the kingdom of pure felicity. Like the kingdom of pure felicity. And known as the majestic heavenly light and ornament. So it's very, when you see these sorts of names applied, there's this, the Jade Emperor. At birth, he emitted a wondrous light that filled the entire kingdom. Now this is Taoist mythology, but what do you notice? Light. If you study any religion, light is always seen as significant and related to truth somehow. The light came into the world. Right? In Hinduism, you find the light as in the sun god Surya. In Zoroastrianism, there's the Ahura Mazda's light. The Buddha is always surrounded by light. Light. L-I-G-H-T. He devoted his entire childhood to helping the needy and the disabled. He made sure everyone in his kingdom found peace and contentment. And after that, he told his ministers he wished to cultivate the Tao. He wanted to cultivate the Tao. So this is how he becomes tied into the Taoist tradition. He was probably a folk figure who then became incorporated by saying, I want to manifest in my life the Tao. Okay, we talked about big numbers when we talked about Hinduism and Buddhism. Well, we find it here too. After 1,750 eons, each lasting 129,600 years, he attained golden immortality. Okay. So, the Jade Emperor, again, is associated with this notion of immortality. One of the ultimate desires in Taoism. Then there's what are known as the three pure ones. The three pure ones. These were sort of deities of the intellectual elite in Taoism. They were at the top of the pantheon. They were regarded as pure manifestations of the Tao. They are pure sort of like, again, if you want a comparison, just as Jesus might be seen an incarnation of the Father, these are seen as manifestations or incarnations of the Tao and the origin of all sentient beings. So they're also creators. They're manifested from the Tao, and then they create all sentient beings. Do you remember in the Hindu myth of Vishnu, the belly button, he's lying on the sea, asleep, out of his belly button comes a lotus, and then the god Brahma, and it's Brahma who creates the beings. Vishnu's behind it all. Brahma comes out of Vishnu. That's one of the interesting distinctions in the creation stories. In the Judeo-Christian Islamic creation story, God creates. In these stories, God's behind all this, but some other element creates. Which is a way a little bit of an advantage when it comes to having to deal with evil. But anyway, we can talk about that later. Okay. There were also gods related to the sky, earth, and underworld. No doubt there's always back and forth between popular folk religion and the major tradition. They get incorporated into one another. Any long-lasting major tradition has to incorporate popular notions. Has to. And it's usually felt that that's where, in the West, that's how Mary came to be so important. That the mother goddesses, the pagan mother goddesses, were so powerful and so staunch in people's worldview that you needed somehow to incorporate that. So Mary becomes somehow an incorporation of those ideas, along with certain elements of the gospel literature. But up until the 12th century, nobody cares about Mary. The cult of Mary really develops in the medieval period. And if you go, I don't know how many of you have been to Italy today, you wander around in the countryside, you're inevitably going to come across a little shrine to Mary. Yeah. And so this is what also happened in the Taoist tradition. And then there were also gods related to past, present, and future. Keep that in mind at the end. Okay, now I want to get a little more abstract. I'm going to move into what we call Taoist cosmology. Okay. This is how it works. It's believed that the Tao, which is the circle, notice the circle, the first circle on the left is what? What's in it? It's empty. It's empty. You see, if something is ineffable, unnameable, it has to be empty. You can't name it. So that's the Tao. From the Tao comes what is known as the Tai Chi. That's the middle circle. So that emerges out of the Tao, which is a state of absolute potentiality. Absolute potentiality. I like to talk with my friend Jerry Clifford about the Big Bang. Where was I at the Big Bang? And he said, you were pure potential. Didn't mean you would manifest, but if everything worked out a certain way as the cosmos expanded, you would manifest. So everything that exists at the Big Bang was potential. Yes, right. Movement or motion. That means from emptiness to motion and potentiality. And what's on the right-hand side? The yin and the yang. So the yin and the yang come out of the Tai Chi. So, so let's take a little closer look at the yin, what I call the yin and yang nexus. The nexus is when things come together. Yin and yang is a concept used to describe how polar opposites or seemingly contradictory forces are interconnected and interdependent in the natural world. What seem to be polar opposites, what seem to be contradictions, are actually connected. And how in turn they give rise to each other. It's often symbolized by what is known as the taijito. That's the symbol there that most people have seen, for which it's probably best known in the West. Opposites only exist in relationship to each other. You can't have light without having dark. You can't have anything without having its opposite. That's the underlying basic notion. Many natural dualities, such as dark and light, low and high, cold and hot, are thought of manifestations of the yin and yang. And the same can be said of male and female. Yin is female, yang is male. Hang on to that for a moment. Yin is the black side. But what do you notice inside the black side? There's a white circle. So they're not polar opposites. In fact, if they were polar opposites, you'd have a circle, you'd have a straight line across, you'd have black above and white below. These curve into one another, and each has the opposing circle within it. So, yin is the black side with a white dot, and yang is the white side with the black dot. The relationship is often described in terms of sunlight playing over a mountain in the valley. Yin, the shady place or north slope, is the dark area which is covered by the mountain's bulk initially. While yang, the sunny place or south slope, is the brightly lit portion. As the sun moves across the sky, yin and yang gradually trade places, with each other revealing what was obscured and obscuring what was revealed. It's a wonderful image if you want to try and understand it.
Is it always portrayed with the dark on the top and the light on the bottom?
Well, see the one, if we go, no, because sometimes it's on the right and on the left. If you go back to our original, there. There's the right and the left. Yeah, yeah. So do you get that picture? As the sun moves across, the dark gradually becomes light, and the light gradually. So which is which? They're both necessary. They're both dependent on one another. It's called interdependence. We tend to think of things as dark and light. We're taught to think dualistically, right, Rhonda? This is saying everything is interdependent. Everything depends on its opposite to some degree and changes over time with flow. Changes over time with flow. So yin is female, is characterized. These are the characteristics. And this is, of course, from a patriarchal society. Okay, you've got to remember that. Slow, soft, yielding, cold, wet, passive. And is associated with water, the moon, and nighttime. That's the yin. Yang, which is seen as masculine, is fast, hard, solid, focused, hot, dry, and aggressive. It's associated with fire, sky, and daytime. But it's important to stress that yin yang are not opposite forces, but complementary opposites interacting with a greater whole in a dynamic system. We all have our yin and we all have our yang. Male have female aspects, females have male aspects. And sometimes those manifest themselves differently for various reasons. Could be chemical, could be time, could be lots of things. But you never have all male, which can be shown because we now know what? You can change gender. We know it. So there was some reality to that, okay? Nothing is all, the point in the yin yang, nothing is all in everything. Nothing is solid. Everything is in flux. Everything interacts with something else. So everything has both yin and yang aspects. As light cannot exist without darkness, and male cannot exist without female. But either of these aspects may manifest more strongly in one situation or another. And that has all sorts of variations. A way to illustrate this is to postulate the notion of humanity comprised only of men or only of women. What would happen? Wouldn't be humanity for very long, right?
No babies.
No babies. So you need both. You need both male and female for the species to survive, and you need both understanding of your male and female sides for you to be a healthy individual. Thus, yin and yang, as male and female, transform each other. Life is a continual process of transformation. Nothing stands still. You ever looked at your pictures when you're like 5? Who is that? I thought it'd be interesting if you had a picture for every day from the time you were 5 to now and just went through it. Yeah. At a certain point, you notice change, but you usually don't notice change from one day to the next. At what point do you notice change? It's interesting. Interesting question. Okay. So the concept of yin and yang is structurally expressed in 2 famous texts. The first one we've seen, is the, I don't have the number, is the Tao Te Ching, okay? You find a lot about yin and yang in the Tao Te Ching. And in the Tao Te Ching, it focuses on yin, feminine. The Tao Te Ching as a text mentions both, but it really focuses on yin, or the feminine principle. And it's based on the following reference to the Tao as the mysterious female. It refers to the Tao as the mysterious female. As it says, the valley spirit never dies. It is named the mysterious female. And the doorway to the mysterious female is the base from which heaven and earth sprang. So there's a lot of emphasis put on the feminine principle in Taoism, especially in the Tao Te Ching. And it says, it is there within us all the while, that mysterious feminine principle. It's always there. Draw upon it as you will, for it never runs dry. Thus, the Tao Te Ching focuses on the passive, solid, and quiescent qualities of nature, having without possessing. Having without possessing. What can that mean? You can have things, but you shouldn't possess them. They can go away. When you possess something, if you lose it, you tend to have negative emotions. I can have my whatever, and I can play with it, and I can enjoy it. But if something happens to it, and I want to possess it, I'm done for, because I can't possess it anymore. And this is very true of human relationships. It's perhaps one of the biggest reasons for homicide. Who's the first, homicide? Who are the first people they look for? The spouse. Why? Generally because people don't like to lose this notion, you're mine. How dare you leave me? Okay? So this is the notion. You can have things, you can play with them, but don't possess them. Because possessing things are traps. Because then who's in control? The possession. The possession is in control. If something makes you angry, who's in control? They are. So this is a very strong notion, this feminine notion. Have, but don't possess. The male principle wants to possess. It's aggressive, it wants to possess. You can have some of that, but don't lose the yin. Don't become overly notion with controlling things. So here's no masculinity, but maintain femininity. That comes out of the Tao Te Ching. No masculinity, but maintain femininity. And be a ravine for all that is under heaven. Not easy to do, especially in a culture like ours, where you're taught just about from the first day you're born the exact opposite. Okay. A prime yin image is water. Numerous references in the Tao Te Ching to water. Here's an example. The best of man is like water, which benefits all things and does not contend with them, which flows in places that others disdain, where it is in harmony with the Tao. So the sages live within nature, think within the deep, give with impartiality, speak with trust, govern with order, craft with ability, act with opportunity. He does not contend, and none contend against him. Water formed the Grand Canyon. Think of that. And how did it do it? Just flowing. What happens if you try and grab water? Stop, Now we've learned to some degree you can dam up water to a certain point. But even then, so this notion of water, the flow. If you know anything about the Tao, it's the idea of the flow. Be in flow with the Tao. Be in flow with your natural side. Civilization is continually trying to fight against the flow. That's a Taoist position. That's not my position. Okay. Yin concept is non-assertive, and that's a continual theme. So it says, fill the cup to its brim, and it's easily spilled. Temper a sword to its hardest, and it is easily broken. Amass a great treasure, and it's easily stolen. Claim credit and honor, and you easily fall. Pride. Retire once your purpose is achieved. This is natural. Once you've done what you're going to do, retire. Don't try to be better. I don't know if I should say this, but I would suggest this to Tiger Woods at this point. I would suggest this to Tiger Woods at this point. I mean, he's done everything. The notion here, then retire. Retire. Yeah. But you see, there's something in our culture that keeps telling us you can be better than that. You can do better. You can always be better. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with achieving things and being. But at a certain point, you got to realize. Okay, the other text which mentions the yin and yang is the I Ching. And I mentioned this last week. You remember the I Ching? It's the first classic. It's called the Book of Divination. And what is divination? Something that will tell you about the future, prophetic. It became a respected book of wisdom, not only in Taoism, but also in Confucianism, one of the classics. The text of the I Ching is a set of prophetic, or what we call oracular statements, represented by 64 sets of 6 lines called hexagrams. Now you can't make those out, but each one of those is called a hexagram, meaning there are 6 lines in it. Okay? And I don't know if you can tell, but there are 3 on the top of each hexagram and then 3 on the bottom. If you went close and looked up, you'd see that each one of those little boxes are made up of 6 lines. 3 on the top, 3 on the bottom. Each line, each of the individual lines is either yin or yang. Yin is the broken line. It'll have a line, and yang would be a straight line. So if you look at that hexagram, you'll have 6 lines. If they're all yang, they're going to all be straight. If they're all yin, they're going to be all broken lines. How many combinations are there? 64. And those are represented in that totality. Okay? So that's how it's actually set out. So there's all those combinations in between. When used as an oracle, an individual asks a question, such as, is this an auspicious time for a wedding? Or investing in the stock market? That's the modern version, the modern question. A hexagram is then cast using sticks or coins. So you'll drop sticks or coins, which will determine whether the first line is yin or yang. Do it again, second line, third line, fourth line, fifth line, sixth line, and then you'll have one of those hexagrams. Those are the 64 possibilities. Each one of those hexagrams is attached to the text, an answer. And these answers are not usually straightforward. They're they allow you to have an interpretation. So there's an appropriate, and if you can buy the book, the I Ching, if you'll have all these in the back, and you can play with it. And each one of these, so there's 64 commentaries, one for each hexagram. And you read it, you either interpret it yourself, but most people have I Ching specialists who help them interpret these texts. Yes, it might be a good time for a wedding, but sort of think. Moreover, there's the assumption that through personal insight related to time and place. Now, this is where it gets a little mystical. It's called synchronicity. It's believed that at a certain time and a certain place, your psyche will react in a different way. Your psyche is often controlled by things outside of yourself. Have you ever noticed sometimes something happens? It didn't seem very important, and then a little bit later, you see the connection? That's called synchronicity. A bird flew by or something, and then later something happens, bird-related. Your psyche, so there's this belief that the time and place that you're at when you ask the question and actually fix the hexagram has some significance to the answer because it says where you are psychically at that point. If you just come from the bar and you cast the hexagram, you're probably going to answer the question in a different way. Okay, so it has a bit of, and Carl Jung placed a lot of importance on this text, the psychologist Carl Jung, because he believed in a great, what he called synchronicity. Things happen sometimes in very strange ways. You know, you're not expecting something to happen, and then something over here happens, and it connects, and you see it. Yeah.
Is it just a God thing?
A God thing?
When something happens, you relate to it?
I don't think Taoists would call it a God thing. They'd call it a reality thing. Yeah. There is the reality which we float on reality. We often think we create reality. We create a little bit of it, but for the most part, we float on reality. So the Taoists are always interested. How do you connect with reality? Are you really connecting with reality? Or are you connecting with falsehood? So it does raise the question, what is real? Okay. And the understanding of your own masculine, feminine psychic structure and how it fits together is also significant. Meaning, if you're, what do we call, a macho man, okay, you're probably going to read the text a little different than if you maybe come to terms with it's okay to cry. Or if you're super feminist who thinks all males are chauvinist pigs, you might see the text a little different if you say, well, you know, we're all in the same boat, more or less, and we all have our masculine. So that's what it emphasizes. Know every religious tradition at some point says, know yourself. That's the key. Know who you are in relationship to reality. If you don't, well, you can keep going. Okay. So Taoist teachings also emphasize various themes such as naturalness, or this is interesting, and you find this very significant in Japanese thought as well, effortless effort. Effortless effort. What does that mean? Sometimes athletes will talk about effortless effort. They get in the zone. They don't have to will it anymore. They don't have to think about it anymore. They train their muscles enough that they get in the zone. Golfers do that for short periods of time. It seems like they just can't miss a shot. Or I think Joseph Campbell said as a runner, he would get in that zone and he wouldn't get tired. He could run forever and he wouldn't get tired. He wasn't making the effort. He was just allowing it to happen. We often use will. We're so much people of will. But will takes a lot of energy. You ever notice that? When you're really willing something, it's a lot of energy. If you can learn to let it come naturally, that's the idea. Effortless effort. It seems like a contradiction. So thus the Tao Te Ching explains that beings, or phenomena, that are wholly in harmony with the Tao behave in a natural way. If you get in harmony with that ultimate source, and don't try and will everything, allow it to flow through you, that's the goal. That's the goal. That sounds very strange to us because we're just not accustomed to thinking that way. We're thinking, how do you do things? You will things. You get things done. There's nothing wrong with willing things and getting things done. But if that's the only aspect of the way you look at life, you're often going to create neurosis. You can't. God bless you, Dad. My dad was like that. He could not sit still. For 5 minutes, and he's got to do something. We went up to the cabin once up at Big Arrowhead. Chris and I took him up there just to get away, and he went bonkers. He had to go. He had to go home. Nothing to do. He couldn't just sit on the porch and watch the squirrels. By the way, speaking of that, when we visited Dixie Zimmer in her last few days, she was in a hospice and in her bed, and she said, I just love sitting here watching the squirrels. And they were all outside her yard. Yeah, sometimes, yeah. So this is this emphasis. We're so removed from the natural way of being because we're always thinking of doing. So try and get to this, and then to put the two together. That's the key. Do without effort. Usually that means you don't overly care about the results. When you overly care about the results, then you're not doing without effort. If you do without effort, you do the best you can. If you win, you win. You lose, you lose. Who cares? 10 years from now. Who won the 1946 World Series? Do any of you know? I don't even know. I'm just saying, but at that time, it was very important. Okay. So the goal of spiritual practice, according to Lao Tzu, is the attainment of this natural way of behaving. Taoist ethics emphasize what are called the three jewels. And this is, as it is said in this part of the text, this is directed to an emperor. As for things that do not seem like folly, well, there can be no question about their smallness. Here are my three treasures. Guard and keep them. The first is compassion. The second, frugality. The third, refuse to be the foremost of all things under heaven. What is the foremost of all things under heaven? I am the best tiddlywinks player in the cosmos. Okay? Or I refuse that. That doesn't mean you don't play tiddlywinks and do as best you can, but don't confuse who you are with what you do. For only he that has compassion is truly able to be brave. Only he that is frugal is able to be profuse. Only he that refuses to be the foremost of all things is truly able to become chief of all ministers. At present, your bravery is not based on compassion, nor your profusion on frugality, nor your vanguard on your rear. And this is death. Heaven arms with compassion those whom it would not see destroyed. That's a good phrase. Politically, Taoists rejected the Confucian emphasis on social hierarchies and ritual. Remember how hierarchical Confucianism was? In the context of ancient Chinese thought, where the role of government was to impose a single ideology on the people for the sake of unity, Taoism opposed government by teaching that no single guiding view can be constantly right. So striving for uniformity is unwise. Instead, pluralism should be emphasized, allowing different perspectives to coexist. Some major political implications drawn from Taoist thinkers included: punishment is bad and should be avoided. What happens when you punish someone? Do they generally get better? Generally not. That doesn't mean you don't discipline. But when you start punishing people, what's their reaction going to be? Oh, I like this. No, their reaction is generally going to be negative and may end up creating more of. Government does best when it facilitates people's natural way of living. Rule best by ruling least. Rule best by ruling. I think Thomas Jefferson said something similar. The best government is that which makes its presence known least. The best leader is one who speaks infrequently, but effectively. So you can imagine, Taoism never really made a direct political impact. It did have symbolic status during the Tang Dynasty, where Lao Tzu was seen as an ancestor of the dynasty. But by and large, the ideological system has remained, as it has in nearly all governments. Governments tend to be ideological. And so by the 17th century, Taoist influence had really declined dramatically. And during the Qing dynasty, there was emphasis on rigid Confucianism, which meant that all the Taoist texts were taken out of the imperial library. Why? They were seen as, it's sort of like the reaction to a lot of people to the youth of the 60s. What do you mean, drop in, drop out? That notion was seen so. And thus Taoism has remained sort of a minor religion, even in modern China, although it's been incorporated into philosophies, etc. Today, it comes under the control of the China Taoist Association, which is under the control of the communist government, as are all religions. Religions in China are allowed to exist as long as they don't cross over certain lines, mainly political, as long as they don't threaten the status quo. So I thought I would leave you with this ending quote. Can you see this? Can someone read that? 'Cause if you're depressed, you're living in the past. If you're anxious, you're living in the future. If you're at peace, you are living in the present moment. Just think about it. What causes most depression? Thinking about what happened. Yeah, something I did or someone else did. Or what happened? When are you anxious? What's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen to the stock market? Then that leads to anxiety. Only the present moment has the possibility of peace. You find a similar idea in Buddhism as well. Okay, that brings us to a close for Taoism. Any thoughts, questions, insights? What's that? Yes, everyone loves jade. Yeah. When we were in China, they took us to special jade factories. Yeah, for me to buy for Chris. Yes, I did.
I was thinking when you were talking about the contrast of things, yin and yang, I recently did a small thing in my circle. I like Khalil Gibran a lot. Mm-hmm. And so I did a reading on kindness and sorrow. 2 days later, on Facebook, I got one of those poetry things, and it was a quote from William, what is his name? I'm thinking Bradford, but that's wrong. 1600s. Big, he was a theological guy. It was on joy and sorrow, much shorter. And then I'm thinking of this, and I thought it all tied together. William, whatever his last name is, he was first of those two, but Khalil Gibran took up a lot of other things that the Tao touched.
Yeah, and what you were just talking about to me is the synchronicity in your own experience. The synchronicity that of these things coming together. You're thinking this a few days before, this appears. We can say, just random chance. Yeah, and it may be. But Jung thought often many of these things were a little more complex than just random chance. There were elements here that we don't quite understand how they fit together. And he called it synchronicity. Okay, I will be here next week because I'm getting the cataract done tomorrow, but I should be okay for next Tuesday, and we'll do a Buddhism. Then the following day, I will get the retina done, and so I'll take the following week off, and then we'll come back a week after that and do Christianity in China, which a lot of people don't realize. They think there are a large number of Christians. Well, there are a large number of everything in China, but a large number of Christians. And one of the biggest revolts in the history of China was led by a Christian. So anyway, we'll so we'll deal with that next time. But thanks for coming, and see you next time.